we mustn't throw away everything that happened before as this just purely evil and bad. We must have a sober look at the past. We must learn from it.
Delighted to welcome to the show Konstantin Kisin. The Russian-born comedian and journalist's new book is An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, which was published on Thursday. As well as writing about his family's history of being oppressed by the Soviet regimes of the 20th century, Kisin says the purpose of the book is to describe and diagnose the malaise afflicting Western society and to offer solutions. Konstantin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much for being on. So look, how would you describe that malaise you're talking about, this malaise affecting Western society?
A gigantic and widespread loss of confidence in ourselves.
Right. Okay. Among institutions or people?
I think it's both. I think it's people who then become part of institutions who have control over them, and the institutions then become unable to project or even admit that there are such things as Western values, British values. These are things that are really important. And we've seen, certainly in the last few months, something I've been talking about for many years now, which is you can do this sort of introspection and navel gazing when it's a safe, comfortable world in which there's globalization and everyone trades with each other. But when we have hostile actors out there in the world who want to challenge the West, which they absolutely do, then we can't afford to be doing that anymore. And I think that's why I feel the book is well timed, because people are now starting to open their eyes to what's happening.
When you see this collapse in people of confidence and self-identity in this way, do you mean all people? Do you mean normal people? Or at the risk of special pleading, do you just mean people like me?
Well, people like me and you, I suppose, the sort of chattering classes, of course. But the difficulty is, Hugo, that the chattering classes do set the agenda in this country, as they do in every country. And so what happens at the sort of elite media political level does really matter. And if we become convinced that we are the worst people in the history of the world, that we are this terrible country that must forever atone for things that were done by people who looked remotely like us 300 years ago, we're going to take eye off the ball. I mean, you look at the leadership contest for the Conservative Party at the moment. The leaders been forced to spend quite a bit of time sort of, explaining GCSE biology, defining the word woman and so on. We can't afford to be doing that anymore.
Do you think they've been forced to, or do you think they're choosing to because they reckon there's political points in it?
No, I think they've been forced to. I mean, if you look at Penny Mordaunt, for example, who has a sort of conflicting history of statements on this issue, she's been forced to come out and say, actually, I know what a woman is, and I believe that women should have rights and other things that I would have thought were all self-explanatory, because she needs to explain to people who are questioning her, because she's made some very different statements in the past about an issue that frankly shows a sort of, a lack of judgment, a lack of understanding, etc. So I do think that all politicians are increasingly forced to address these issues and spend an inordinate amount of time on them, and that's a problem.
Okay, so I guess let's start with some basics. When you're talking about the West, where do you mean specifically? You're talking about all of the EU? I mean, not Hungary, presumably.
No. Well, this is a very good criticism of the title of the book. I regret having to be forced to call it An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, because to me it's more An Immigrant's Love Letter to the Anglosphere. That's the countries that I'm talking about. The French and Germans, they have their own conception of the world. The French conception of liberty and freedom, and the way that they came to those positions is much too obsessed with rationality, in my view. The English tradition of honoring history and tradition, to me, seems much more important in this context. We mustn't throw away everything that happened before as this just purely evil and bad. We must have a sober look at the past. We must learn from it. We must continue to teach all elements of it to our children, and preserve what we have.
How much of this is to do with patriotism? Do you think the country would be much improved if people were more comfortable with patriotism? Do you think people aren't comfortable with patriotism?
Oh, no, I don't think they are comfortable. I'm wary of the word patriotism, because it does have in this country certainly negative connotations, and frankly in many others. I'm from Russia now, where there's a huge spike in patriotism at the moment, which is associated with invading a neighboring country and massacring people. So I'm wary of that attitude. But I do think we have to have a healthy view of ourselves. That means that we see ourselves objectively. We see the history of our country through the lens of, yes, slavery and colonialism, but also of the good things that we've done. And the most importantly, Hugo, the context of those issues. I have a whole chapter on those issues in the book, because it's really important that when we look at the bad things that this country has done in the past, we also understand what was happening around the world at the same time. We can only be progressive in our own time, and that's really, really important for people to remember.
Well, I mean, on patriotism specifically, we've just excuse me, we've just had the Jubilee, vast outpourings of what some might call quite unfashionable patriotism, but it turns out the things that we think about are fashionable, aren't fashionable, actually have huge currency among among most people. Do you find this heartening or surprising?
I find it heartening. I don't find it that surprising because I do think actually the majority of ordinary people in this country, as you sort of alluded to at the beginning, have a solid sense of the right way of dealing with this, which is we don't want to be jingoistic. We also don't want to beat ourselves up constantly about things that we ourselves haven't done. That to me is a healthy thing. But as I say, the chattering classes, the elite discourse, as some people want to call it, is a problem at the moment because it will take public opinion with it. And we will see policies. That's the most important thing. We will see policies enacted and laws enacted that take us backwards instead of forwards. And that worries me, particularly because it's undemocratic. It's not reflective of the views of the majority of the people of this country.
So some would say, excuse me, this is hay fever, I promise. Some would say that even among the chattering classes, as we call them, look, you have the majority. We have a conservative government, a relatively right-wing conservative government, with candidates keen to display their. We'll come to the term in a minute because it's problematic, but problematic is itself problematic. So keen to display their anti-work credentials. The bulk of newspapers in this country perhaps have a sort of a right-wing conservative leading. Do you mean the chattering classes, or do you mean kind of the Twitter classes?
Well, they're becoming one and the same, aren't they?
Do you think they really are?
I do, of course, yeah. And, well, certainly I'm somewhere in the center. I'm critical of some of the extremes on the left at the moment because they concern me a lot. And so I see the extent to which opinions like mine are unfashionable. And anyone who sort of says, well, maybe the left has gone a little bit too far in this direction, sort of automatically becomes right-wing and evil and a bigot and all the rest of it. So I do think that's happening. But more importantly, as I say, I think some of our institutions, whether it's the National Trust or whatever, and other much more consequential institutions are getting to a position where instead of celebrating what's best about Britain, they're attempting to denigrate it, and that worries me.
Tell us a bit about your own life growing up in the Soviet Union. You write about having lived in extreme poverty at times, with little access to even the most basic of necessities, but you also say you experienced great wealth as well. What was your family's situation?
So when I was born in the early 80s, my parents, my mum had been 18 for 4 days. And my dad was at 20. They were both students at Moscow University. My mum's main memory of that time that she always was fond of telling me was how one time when I was probably 2 or 3, I opened the fridge and started glugging milk out of the carton. And she came in to discover this, and she was horrified because that was the only food that we had for the day. That was the situation. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was a time of extraordinary opportunity for many people, as well as obviously a desperate time for many people too. And my dad was one of the people who managed to take advantage. He was sort of a mini oligarch for a few years. Then he was a junior minister in Boris Yeltsin's government. And then he was falsely accused of a few things due to political machinations in the country and had to flee Russia under a false identity, losing all the money that he'd accumulated in the process. So we went from being extremely poor to being extremely wealthy, back to being extremely poor within the space of about 10 years. So I've kind of seen it all from different sides.
That's a very Russian story. So what age were you when you first came to Britain then?
I was 13.
What did you immediately notice and or love about your new country?
You know, one of the things that I still remember to this day is when I came to school here, I spoke like this very strong Russian accent, barely spoke at all. And the other kids would make fun of me, of course, as kids always do. And whenever I'd complain, they'd say, well, this is a free country. And actually, over time, I've really grown to appreciate that. I do think I prefer to live in a society where people are allowed to say things I don't like than a society in which they're not. And that is, I think, really, really important and something we're forgetting in the West, particularly in the Anglosphere, the idea that we must live in a society where we can hear people who we disagree with very strongly and be really, really grateful for the fact that they have the opportunity to speak, and we do too.
To clarify that, you came here, you were mocked for your accent, and you were glad to live in a country where you could be mocked for your accent.
Over time, I developed that attitude. I'm not claiming that as a 13-year-old I was so enlightened, but when I think about the alternatives, Hugo, and this is genuinely important, when I think about the alternatives to societies in which freedom of speech is encouraged and celebrated, I do think on balance that's a better way of doing things.
Konstantin, you were talking about when you first came to Britain, and one of the things you liked most was the fact that people could, that's the whole point, I suppose, say the unsayable here, ask uncomfortable questions. When we talk today about Britain, or at least some people in Britain, or some institutions in Britain, wanting to interrogate the country's past, interrogate involvement in slavery and behaviour as colonial rulers and so on, Isn't that just asking uncomfortable questions?
It is asking uncomfortable questions, but I'm afraid it goes well beyond that, of course. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that anybody should be banned from doing that. That's why I wrote An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, because I don't think the counter perspective has been offered nearly enough. And frankly, we do live in a society where it's quite difficult to offer. I suspect that had I been a white British-born man, all of those other terms, it would have been much more difficult to say what I'm saying now and to have the book published in the first place, even though it wasn't particularly easy to get it published anyway. Right? So we do live in that society. And of course, people should be able to ask all sorts of questions, but we're going beyond that. We're starting to teach certain very contested ideas about our history as fact. That worries me. And,
Give me an example.
Well, the idea, for example, that the West's history of slavery is somehow uniquely evil or special, or that we must atone for it in some way, or that we are to be held responsible, or that you and I must be held accountable for the actions of people in the past, or compensate for them, or atone for them. I think this is an extraordinarily backward idea, that people decided that punishing children for the sins of their fathers was a very bad idea thousands of years ago, and we seem to have gone back to that to some extent. But also, let me give you an example that I talk about in the book. My grandfather in the Soviet Union in the late 80s. We're not talking about Stalinism here. We're talking about late 80s or mid 80s. He made some comments about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a hot button issue in the Soviet Union at the time. And he was immediately made unemployable, ostracized by many of his friends. And that's how he eventually ended up coming to the UK, because he just couldn't live in the Soviet Union. It's not all that different to some people who make a comment on a hot button issue now, and suddenly they're not employable, or they lose their column, or they lose their job in Asda, as happened to a guy who shared a Billy Connolly routine on his Facebook, or people being investigated by the police who say, we need to check your thinking. These are all very sort of Soviet ways of doing business, and that concerns me. I've seen this before. To many people, many of this sort of cancel culture and things like that sort of don't know where it came from. But actually, most people don't know where the term political correctness comes from. Do you?
Yeah, well, I do, because I've read your book.
Right, very good. But it comes from the Soviet Union, and it never had anything to do with preventing offense or being kind to people or being polite or being respectful. It was a way of enforcing the dogma of the party of the day. And I'm concerned that there are elements that I'm seeing in Western society now that do remind me of that.
Do you think that Russia, as a nation, should have a sense of shame about what happened to your grandfather?
I don't think Russia as a nation should have a sense of shame about what happened to my grandfather. I think that it's important that what happened to people like my grandfather is taught in Russia, which it's not. And it's important that, it's taught in such a way that people like Joseph Stalin, who killed more Russians than Hitler did, he's currently the most popular historical figure in Russia. Now, it seems to me that history has been taught very badly in Russia, as it has been in this country too.
I guess I ask because I'm not sure where we draw the line between making sure we teach children about these past contentious things, these past inglories of a nation, and triggering objections such as your own.
I'm someone who insists that we must teach history way more than we do, and much broader than we do. I think the way, we have these conversations, are we talking enough about slavery? No, we're not. Except what we mean by slavery is, of course, the history of Western colonialism. We don't talk about what was happening in China at the time, in my country, in Russia in the time, where the vast majority of people were serfs. They were slaves until, I think, 1865, around the very same period of time that people were enslaved elsewhere. So I'm all for teaching more history, because that's what helps you understand it. We have a saying in Russian, everything is understood in context. And I'm afraid many of the things that we're now talking about in the context of this conversation, we're not talking about them with a full understanding of things that happen outside of the West. This is why I wanted to write An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. I wanted to give people a bit more context to all of these different issues that we're now talking about, so that we can look at ourselves and go, look, yeah, we've got problems, but actually we do have quite a good society, and maybe we shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater.
So when it comes to something like a statue of Winston Churchill, for example, some people believe leave it alone, some people believe pull it down, some people believe affix a sign to it that puts his actions in context, etc., etc. You're basically saying you should have a really, really long sign that not only puts his actions in context, but also asks us to consider what was going on in Japan in the same period.
Yeah, I think that I'm afraid if our children are learning about history from signs on statues, we're in a bad place. That's my concern. I think we really don't do a good job of teaching people history. And look, I was fortunate, my education here coincided with that brief period in my family's history when we had money. So I went to a good school. We didn't get taught about history very well, particularly. We got taught a little bit about World War II. And that was really about all that I can remember from school. And I think that's probably true of most people. We don't really understand ourselves or the history of our country very well, let alone the world. So we really need to do a better job. And a plaque on a statue isn't going to do that.
As a comedian, you've fought against cancelling and censorship and the like. Can and should comedy have boundaries, or like Rowan Atkinson said recently, is the job of comedy to offend or have the potential to offend?
Well, both can be true at once. I think the boundaries will always exist, but what people don't really understand about comedy is it's incredibly self-regulating and self-selecting. As a comedian, when you're going on stage, you don't want to go on stage and annoy people or offend them. Even if you're doing offensive material, you're still trying to make them laugh. And the way that as a comedian you regulate your own jokes and material is you go, okay, that crossed the line. Maybe I won't do that joke again, or maybe I will reframe or rephrase the way that I do that joke and see if I can, or maybe I need to add something. But the problem we have in our current society is comedians are increasingly not allowed ever to go over the line at all. In the past, you could say, well, look, I'm going to cross the line, see what happens, and then I'll pull back. And next time I do this bit of material, I'll make sure to take that into account. But if every time you cross the line, there's a mob at your door, or there's someone in the comedy club saying, don't book this guy again, which happens very often now, then we've got a problem because it's stifling creativity. And, when we had Lionel Shriver on my YouTube show, Trigonometry, she made this point, the writer, of course, that we don't even know which books are not getting written at the moment. We don't know which jokes are not being told. We're losing a lot of cultural creativity because we're stifling ourselves and we're muzzling ourselves.
Do you think that's entirely bad? Do you not think there are people who, for example, would have sat there being deeply upset in a comedy show? There would have been jokes that came out of sitcoms and plagued children in playgrounds for generations that now no longer happen.
Yeah, I don't really buy that argument, and frankly, I don't really care if someone is offended in a comedy club. That's what you go to a comedy club for. You go there to be surprised. All humor is based on an element of surprise. You can't expect to be surprised and always pleasantly so, right? If you go and see 4 comedians on a night, some of them will be to your liking, some will not. You either accept that or you don't go to comedy.
Yeah, I know, understood. Look, the book went to press just as Russia invaded Ukraine in February, and you have family in Ukraine, and I assume
And
in Russia
too,
as
of course,
well.
yeah.
Yes. How are they?
They're okay. I mean, obviously, my Russian family are horrified by what the country is doing, and it makes it difficult for them because I don't know how much you know about some of the restrictive measures that Russia is putting in place. Again, a nice contrast with where we are today. But people started out going and protesting. They immediately got arrested, of course.
Yeah,
Then they
of course.
started protesting on their own. They would stand with a sign saying, I am for peace. They would get arrested. Then people started standing with no sign, just their hands in the air. They would get arrested for that. So my family in Russia are in a bad place, and of course in Ukraine it's even worse because they're fortunately all okay at the moment. But from the things that I'm hearing about what's been happening, it's just awful. Awful. And I certainly do feel shame about what Russia is doing in Ukraine at the moment.
No, understood. Look, we're very nearly out of time, but before I let you go, you were on Question Time with Penny Mordaunt not that long ago. Did she impress you? Do you have a view on the leadership election?
I do have a view. I mean, Penny Mordaunt seemed fine to me when we met. I wasn't blown away. I also wasn't particularly disappointed. I thought she handled herself very well. I'm having read some more about some of her opinions. I'm less persuaded that she's the right candidate personally. The only politician that I remember sort of giving me any sort of enthusiasm in the last many years is Kemi Badenoch, who I'm very impressed with, actually. I have been for some time, to be honest. I was a little bit concerned that she had voted with the government on vaccine passports. That was the one issue that I was concerned. My understanding is she did so because she went along with the government. And I do accept we don't live in a society anymore where politicians resign on matters of principle, generally speaking. So there was maybe perhaps too much to expect for that to happen. But other than that, I think she's got exactly the right attitude. One of the things that she posted yesterday that I was very impressed with was she was saying how, as a minister, she refused to be pushed around by civil servants and others, and how she wouldn't let this country be pushed around internationally. As I say, I think we're entering an era of international relations where that's going to be very, very important. And she said, we're not a country to be trifled with. I haven't heard a politician in this country say that for a very long time. And that is the attitude that we and the United States are going to need to have for the foreseeable future.
Well, look, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, but unfortunately we are out of time. I hope you'll come back on the show. That is Konstantin Kisin, and his book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, was published on Thursday. Thanks very much indeed, Konstantin, for being with us.